What would you do if the woman you just helped rebuild an abandoned cabin turned out to be the birth mother of your son, a boy who's never known what a mother's face looks like? And what if she was also a billionaire, running away from a life she no longer wanted, carrying a secret that could change everything? A man who once lost it all, a child who's only ever dreamed of a faceless mother, and a woman who thought she'd forgotten the way back home. They cross paths in a place no one goes searching for miracles, in the frozen mountains, inside a crumbling cabin. If you're someone who loves stories that heal, that feel raw and honest, and linger in your heart long after they end, then hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story about second chances, quiet acts of kindness, and the magical ways we reconnect. And don't forget to drop a comment below, because maybe, just maybe, you've stood before a door like that too. Now let me take you on this journey. At the misty mountains of Willowshade Retreat, where the wind creaks through the wooden rooftop like memories refusing to stay buried, Daniel Pierce quietly lived with his 8-year-old son in an old cabin he had rebuilt with his own hands. No one knew why a man once destined for a bright future in the city chose to leave everything behind and vanish into this forgotten corner of the world. But Daniel remembered, so clearly, because the woman he loved most disappeared one morning without a word, leaving behind a baby still in the crib and a silence that had never truly been filled. Day after day, he patched the roof, chopped firewood, fixed fences, not because he needed a strong house, but because he needed something to keep himself from collapsing, like everything else once had, until that one afternoon, when a woman appeared at the edge of the woods, soaked, tired, and visibly lost. She said her car had broken down, said she was just passing through, said she needed a place to stay the night. Daniel, like always, didn't ask too many questions, but her eyes, those eyes that seemed to have seen him before, known him before, lost him before, made his heart stumble. He didn't remember who she was, but his body did. His heart did. And when she stepped into the cabin and looked at the little boy playing with a toy truck on the floor and smiled, not a polite smile, but something trembling, something buried for 8 years trying not to break, Daniel knew. He couldn't name the feeling, but he knew something was beginning again, not a love story, but the return of something once believed to be lost. And he wasn't ready, but the heart, like an old door, if someone knocks softly enough, might still open again. It was a late autumn day at Willowshade Retreat. The wind blew down from the mountains, carrying the scent of damp earth and the rustling whispers of dry pine needles. Daniel Pierce was hunched over, reinforcing the door of the wooden shed, when a sudden sound broke the stillness. 3 gentle knocks on the front gate. He wasn't expecting anyone. The woman standing there, Grace Harper, wore a thin jacket that did little against the wind. Her dark hair was tousled, touched by mist and miles traveled. She didn't ask for much, just said her car had broken down near the curve by the stream, and she needed a place to stay the night. Daniel didn't press. He led her inside, poured her a cup of hot tea, and pointed down toward an old hunting tools cabin at the foot of the hill, now worn down, long forgotten. "The frame's still solid," he said. "I can help you fix it up if you'd like a bit of space to yourself." Grace nodded. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at him, long and quiet, as if something between them had once shattered, but not completely disappeared. The next afternoon, they worked side by side, hauling planks, patching the roof, sawing away the rotted beams. She didn't talk much, but her hands knew how to hold a nail. She bent just right at the waist. She stood close, but never in a way that made him feel alone. And little by little, Daniel began to realize she didn't seem like someone who'd gotten lost by accident. She felt like someone trying to find her way back to a place that once felt like home, but unsure if she still had the right to return. When Noah, their 8-year-old boy, ran up and handed her a tiny toy truck he'd found under a pile of leaves, Grace let out a short, fragile laugh. And in that moment, the look in her eyes froze Daniel in place, because it wasn't just unfamiliar. It was the gaze of someone who had once lost something they never had a name for, and now was seeing it again, real and alive, right in front of them. There was one thing Daniel Pierce didn't know, that the woman standing beside him, holding a saw, sweeping away cobwebs, helping him rebuild a forgotten cabin, was the birth mother of Daniel Jr., the boy he had cradled, raised, and protected for 8 years, believing all that time that the woman who brought him into the world had left for good. But Grace Harper knew. From the very first moment she laid eyes on the boy, with eyes so much like hers and dark hair that mirrored Daniel's. She knew, but she couldn't say it, not because she didn't want to, but because she had been the one who left. And what if telling the truth only shattered what little was left? That afternoon, while Daniel Jr. laughed in the yard and ran over to press a wildflower into her hand, he said brightly, "You should plant this near your window. Dad says wildflowers survive like hope does." Grace turned away, not because she was touched, but because fear was cracking open inside her chest. She had once carried this child inside her, had once written his name in the pages of a journal. But then, everything was taken from her, with nothing more than a plane ticket and a lie cruel enough to shape the next decade of her life. Now she was no longer the frightened 19-year-old girl. She was a woman hidden behind billions, cloaked in anonymity. A billionaire no one could reach, except for the boy now calling someone else mom every single day. And Grace knew all it would take was one word, son, and everything would change. Maybe there'd be forgiveness. Maybe there'd be an ending. But still, she said nothing. Because sometimes, silence is the only way to hold on to something precious, even if it's just for one more day. That afternoon, while Daniel was prying loose the rotted boards from the back wall of the cabin, the crowbar struck something hard. A strange metallic sound echoed, something that didn't belong to decayed wood or rusted nails. He stopped. Beneath layers of dust and crumbling debris, they found an old tin box, bent out of shape by time, wedged between two beams. No lock, no name, just a faded silver ribbon wrapped around it, as if someone had once tried to package something precious, but never had the courage to send it away. Daniel lifted the lid, and for a single heartbeat, his world froze. Inside were letters, written in handwriting so soft, so hauntingly familiar, it sent a chill through his spine. He picked one up. "Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know, no matter how far I've been pulled away, my heart never stopped returning to you." Grace stood silently beside him, her lips pressed tightly together. And when Daniel looked up, his eyes met hers. And something shattered. There was no doubt anymore. No more pretending. "I wrote those, but I never sent them," she whispered, as if confessing to a part of her past even she was afraid to face. "I thought I had lost everything. I didn't dare to hope." Daniel said nothing. He just kept turning the pages, one by one. Every word cut deeper. In one letter she wrote about a baby not yet born, about the terror of losing the right to be his mother, about a cold, sterile hospital room where she cried herself empty. The day she realized she no longer had a choice, the wind blew through the cracks in the cabin, carrying the scent of pine and the sting of pain not yet healed. And in that moment, Daniel understood. Not everyone leaves because they want to. Sometimes they're pushed away, but their hearts, they still try to leave a trace, like letters tucked away in silence for 8 long years, waiting for someone brave enough to open them. That night the cabin was so still, even the crackle of firewood in the stove felt like it was keeping time for a confession that had waited far too long to be spoken. Grace sat in the old chair by the window, hands clasped together, trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she was about to say. Daniel sat across from her. He didn't rush her. He just looked at her with the eyes of a man who had known loss and had learned how to listen. "The day I told my father I was pregnant, he didn't get angry," she began, voice steady but hoarse. "He gave orders. The flight out of the city was booked for the next morning. My phone was taken, my accounts frozen, and within a week I was in New York, thrust into a world that didn't belong to me, a place where no one called my name. No one knew I had once had a Daniel, or a child growing inside me that I would never be allowed to meet." Daniel's fist tightened. not out of anger, but because he could picture it, every second of the loneliness she had carried alone. I believed maybe you didn't need me after all, she continued, barely above a whisper, that maybe you had moved on, that if I came back, I'd only shatter whatever pieces I had left behind. He didn't respond. He just kept looking into her eyes, now shimmering with tears, trying to hold on to one last shred of composure. Last year, she said quietly, I came across a small article. A mechanic named Daniel Pierce was honored for rebuilding homes after a flood. And in the photo, you were holding a little boy, brown hair, familiar eyes. I didn't need to look twice to know. He was my son. There were no tears in the room. But something crumbled, silently. Not the past, but the wall they both thought was too high to climb. And Daniel, with all the gentleness left in a heart that had been broken and patched 1,000 times, said just one thing. I should have tried harder to find you. Daniel didn't say a word the next morning. He lit the fire in silence, made breakfast for Daniel Jr., then stepped out of the cabin without glancing at Grace once. She understood, and she didn't expect easy forgiveness, because no one can wrap up 8 years of pain in a single apology. But what Grace didn't know was that while Daniel stood out there in the pines, hammer in hand, staring at the half-built fence, he cried, quietly, but completely undone. Not because she had lied, but because he had waited so long for her to come back, and convinced himself that hope had already died. That afternoon, he returned to the cabin carrying a small lantern. He set it on the table without a word, then simply said, if you're still planning to fix up this cabin, we're going to need some light. Grace turned away to hide her tears, not because of the light, but because the darkness inside her had just been lit, from within, by someone else. In the days that followed, they didn't talk much about the past. They simply worked together, repaired the roof, planted herbs by the windowsill, walked Daniel Jr. to school in Larkspur Ridge, and waited together at the gate, smiling when he ran back with dirt on his shoes and joy on his cheeks. Daniel started to laugh again. Grace learned how to bake without burning the crust. And Daniel Jr.? He started calling Grace by a shorter, softer word, Mom. One afternoon, as they sat quietly on the front porch, Grace whispered, I don't think I deserve this. Daniel turned to her. The anger was long gone. Only steadiness remained. Not everyone gets a second chance, he said, but you chose to come back, and I chose to forgive. And just like that, something that once felt dead between them came back to life, not with roses, but with patience, with honesty, and with 2 hands rebuilding the roof over a heart that had collapsed once. The morning at Larkspur Commons Hall was colder than usual, but inside the air was so heavy, you could almost taste it. Chairs were neatly arranged, sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting a soft glow on the old wooden podium, where Grace Harper, dressed in a simple sweater, stood in silence for a beat longer than expected before she began to speak. I'm not standing here with a title, she said, her voice steady but low. I didn't come to apologize. I came to tell the truth. Below her, the townspeople of Larkspur Ridge, many of whom had whispered her name, sat quietly. Daniel and Daniel Jr. were among them. The boy held his father's hand, eyes fixed on his mother, as if he were watching something miraculous unfold. Grace spoke of a past that had been cut off, of the name she had lived under, a life beneath the spotlight that never felt real, of wealth, of power, and the loneliness that shadowed it all. She spoke of the truth she had carried like a weight, until the day she saw a photo in a news article, a father, a son. And in that moment, 8 years of carefully built walls crumbled in a single breath. She paused, then reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I once owned 30 acres surrounding Willowshade Retreat, she said. Today, I'm officially donating more than half of that land to the town, and I ask that it be named Silver Pine Haven, a place for anyone who's ever lost their way, to come and find themselves again. Silence, then applause. Not for her wealth, but for her courage. Daniel was the first to stand. He didn't say a word, just walked forward, took her hand. a quiet confirmation that she didn't have to run anymore, that what they'd lost had finally been found again, not in a tower of glass and steel, but among pine trees, and the hearts brave enough to open. At first, they just watched from a distance, half-trusting eyes, awkward greetings, as if Grace Harper's presence was a strange wind they hadn't yet figured out how to read. A woman who once lived in silk and chandeliers, now standing in line at Maple and Company, market, sleeves rolled up, checking inventory alongside locals who knew more about muddy fields than city lights. She didn't correct anyone, didn't explain. She just worked. Under the dim lights of ridge tools and timber, Grace learned how to pick the right screw sizes, how to name types of wood like she'd grown up there, how to quietly wipe dust from the counters when no one was watching. No one mentioned her past, but everyone looked. And slowly, one nod at a time, they started greeting her first. One early morning, Mr. Granger, the grumpiest man in town, handed her the keys to the store before heading out. "Don't mess up the receipts," he grumbled, but his eyes had softened. That afternoon, a shy little girl tugged on Grace's sleeve and asked, "Were you the one who gave us the fireplace?" Grace knelt down and took her tiny hand. "Not exactly," she said with a smile, "but I helped a little." The girl grinned, and in that moment, so did the town. The people of Larkspur Ridge didn't open up easily, but they knew how to recognize someone living truthfully. They saw Grace walking in the rain with Daniel to fix the school roof. They saw her bring cornbread to a grieving family. They saw her on the cabin steps, reading aloud to Daniel Jr. as dust settled in. Once they had called her a stranger. Now, they called her Grace. And for someone who had once lost everything, that was a miracle all on its own. Late spring sunlight spilled gently through the pines, touching the patch of earth that once was nothing but forest floor, now transformed into a small garden, blooming with wildflowers and herbs. Beside it, a few simple wooden chairs sat in neat rows. Glass jars holding wind chimes swayed in the soft breeze. There were no ribbons, no glittering name signs, just simplicity and a love that had been tested by time. Grace stepped out from the cabin, wearing an ivory linen dress. Not designer, but hand-stitched with a neighbor's help. Daniel stood beneath a leafy arch, waiting. And in his eyes, no more doubt, no more pain, only the quiet certainty neither of them thought they'd ever find again. Noah, dressed in a tiny tailored suit, was the only one who couldn't hide his excitement. He walked up like a little man, carrying the wooden ring box Daniel had carved himself. From one of the old beams in the cabin, polished to warmth, it still bore a tiny crack. A reminder that nothing needs to be perfect to last. "I used to think I'd lost your mother forever," Daniel said, his voice raw with emotion. "But somehow, she found her way back, and this time she stayed." Grace didn't answer with words. She just took his hand and held on tight. There was no pastor, no formal vows, just truth. And a promise whispered between three souls who had survived life's storm. And when Noah stood on his tiptoes to hand the rings to his father, he whispered, "We're a real family now, right?" Daniel held both their hands. "Not just real," he said. "Complete." Summer arrived in Larkspur Ridge like a gentle promise. The trees were lush, the birds sang freely, and Willowshade Retreat, once just an old cabin in the woods, now echoed with the laughter of three people who were no longer broken. Daniel, Grace, and Daniel Jr. had officially become a family. No paperwork, no binding contracts, just a love they rebuilt, piece by piece, with their own hands. At the edge of the property, Silver Pine Haven was taking shape. Not as a charity project, but as a quiet answer for hearts that had lost their way. People came from everywhere. A war veteran carrying invisible scars, a single mother searching for peace for her child, a man who had once lost everything, starting over. And each one found something here, not a miracle, but a second chance. Grace was no longer the woman who lived behind closed doors. She taught painting to the children at the community center. Daniel kept repairing things, kept tending the garden, and every evening, the three of them sat on the porch, listening to the wind chimes, that soft, familiar sound reminding them A home isn't built with wood alone. It's built with forgiveness, with patience, and with a love deep enough to outlast the storm. And you, if you've stayed with us this far, leave a comment below. What part of this story touched your heart? If you've ever believed that some things once lost can never be found again, maybe Willow Shade Retreat will change your mind. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Stories where love is found in the most unexpected places. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story. In life, there are losses that feel beyond repair. But the story of Daniel, Grace, and Daniel Jr. at Willow Shade Retreat reminds us. Sometimes the miracle isn't in going back to the past. It's in having the courage to face it so we can move forward. Daniel once lived with a closed-off heart, raising his son in the quiet shadow of a wound he never knew how to explain. Grace carried the label of someone who had left, thrown into a world of luxury that felt hollow, where no one ever called her mother. And Daniel Jr. He grew up never having seen the face of the woman who brought him into the world. But when fate brought them back to the same place, not a shining city but an old cabin tucked deep in the woods, they chose not to rebuild from where things had broken, but from something stronger: trust, forgiveness, and the quiet daily acts of love. This story teaches us forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving each other the chance to write what comes next. Love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. And most of all, family isn't always born of blood, but of choice. The choice to stay, to keep showing up, to build together. So if you've ever felt lost, if you've ever believed it was too late to go back, remember this: there are still places like Silver Pine Haven, places where every door can lead to a second chance, if you're brave enough to knock.